The letter arrived on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesday is the day I drive into town to pick up groceries, and I almost didn't stop at the mailbox on the way back. Something made me stop. I don't know what. I've thought about that 100 times since what would have happened if I'd just kept driving up the driveway, gone inside, put the milk in the refrigerator, and never opened that box. My name is Ray Calloway. I'm 63 years old. I live alone on a piece of land outside Billings, Montana, that's been in my family for 3 generations. I have a daughter in Colorado, a son in Oregon, and 2 grandchildren I don't see often enough. My wife, Darlene, passed 8 years ago. I've made my peace with most of the hard things life has handed me. Most of them. The one I never made peace with was my sister. Her name was Carol Ann Calloway. She was 4 years younger than me, which put her at 59 now if she were alive. She had dark brown hair and a laugh that could fill a room, and our mother's green eyes. She was the kind of person who remembered everyone's birthday without writing it down, who sent cards by mail when everyone else had switched to texting, who brought food to neighbors when they were sick without being asked. She was the best of us. That's not something I say lightly. That's just the truth. Carol died in the spring of 1987. She was 24 years old. She drowned in the Yellowstone River on a Friday afternoon in April during a rafting trip with friends about 40 miles east of here. The river was running high and fast. That year they'd had a heavy snowpack and a warm March, and the melt had been brutal. One of the rafts capsized near a section they called Osprey Bend. 2 people made it to shore. One of them was Carol's friend Denise. The other was a man named Gary Pruitt, who would spend the next 30 years trying to forget what he saw that day. Carol didn't make it to shore. They found a body 3 days later, 6 miles downstream, caught in a log jam near the bridge at Worden. The sheriff's department called my parents on a Monday morning. My father drove down to identify her. I went with him because he asked me to, and because I was 27 and I thought that was what you did. You showed up when your family needed you. Even when showing up meant standing in a cold room under fluorescent lights and looking at something you couldn't unsee. My father identified her. She was wearing the blue fleece jacket Carol had bought the previous Christmas. Her hair was dark, the right length. Her face was damaged from the water and the rocks. My father was 61 years old, and he aged a decade in that room. He never fully recovered. My mother was gone by the time I was 40. My father followed her 4 years later. I've always believed, privately, that losing Carol was what broke the both of them. We buried her at Rimrock Cemetery on a gray Thursday in April. There were over 100 people at the service. It rained the whole time. That was 38 years ago. Now I need to tell you about the letter. It came in a plain white envelope with a Wyoming postmark. No return address. My name and address were handwritten in a script I didn't recognize, slightly uneven, like the person writing it wasn't sure how hard to press the pen. Inside was a single sheet of notebook paper, folded in thirds. I stood there by the mailbox in the cold Montana wind and unfolded it. It said, "Ray, I know this is going to sound impossible. I've written this letter 12 times and thrown it away. I don't know how else to say this. I think I might be Carol. I have your family's name written in a notebook I've had for years, and I don't know where it came from. I found a photograph. I need to talk to you. Please don't throw this away. Margaret." A phone number followed. A Wyoming area code. I stood at that mailbox for a long time. Long enough that the wind had turned my ears red by the time I went inside. I set the letter on the kitchen table and looked at it the way you look at something that might be a snake carefully, from a slight distance, not entirely willing to accept what you're seeing. My first thought was that it was a scam. That's where my head went immediately, and I'm not ashamed of it. I'm 63 years old, and I watch the news. I know that people target older men who live alone. I know that grief makes you vulnerable in ways you don't always recognize, and that there are people in this world who are very good at finding that vulnerability and using it. I thought, someone found an obituary. Someone did some research. Someone is going to ask me for money. I didn't call the number that day. I put the letter in the kitchen drawer and went about my afternoon. I made dinner. I watched an hour of television. I went to bed. I lay there in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about Carol's green eyes and the way she used to hum while she did the dishes, And somewhere around 2 in the morning, I got up, went back to the kitchen, took out the letter, and read it again. I think I might be Carol. Not I am Carol. Not I know something you need to hear. Just I think I might be. That uncertainty is what got me. A scammer would be more confident. A scammer would have a polished story and a specific ask. This sounded like someone who was genuinely frightened of what they were saying. I called the number the next morning. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was quiet, measured, like someone who had rehearsed calm. She said, "Hello?" I said, "This is Ray Calloway. I got your letter." There was a long pause. Then she said, "Thank you for calling. I wasn't sure you would." I told her I needed to understand what she was saying. I told her I needed her to start from the beginning and tell me everything, and that I was going to listen, and that I wasn't going to make any judgments until she was done. She said she understood. She said she'd been waiting to tell someone this story for a very long time. Her name was Margaret Holt. She was 58 years old. She lived in a small town outside Casper, Wyoming, where she'd worked for 22 years at a feed and livestock supply store. She was, by her own description, a quiet and ordinary person. She had no family that she knew of. She had a few friends. She had a cat named Biscuit, and a vegetable garden she was proud of. She had built a small and careful life for herself. And she had built it, she said, on a foundation of not knowing. She told me that her earliest reliable memory was of waking up in a hospital bed in Sheridan, Wyoming in the summer of 1987. She was in her mid-20s, though she didn't know her exact age. She had no identification. She had injuries consistent with a serious accident, broken ribs, a fractured collarbone, significant bruising, though the cause was never confirmed. She had no memory of how she had gotten there. She had no memory of who she was, where she came from, or what her name was. The hospital staff called her Jane Doe for 3 weeks. A social worker named Barbara Klein worked her case and eventually helped her get a new identity. Margaret Holt was a name they chose together, somewhat arbitrarily, from a list. They found her a room at a boarding house. They connected her with a job. And Margaret, the woman who had no idea that she might be someone else, put one foot in front of the other and built the only life she knew how to build. I sat in my kitchen and listened to all of this without saying a word. The coffee in my cup went cold. She told me that over the years, fragments came back to her. Not full memories, more like impressions. The smell of pine trees in the morning, a kitchen with yellow curtains, the sound of a creek, a man's voice, low and safe, calling a name she could never quite hear clearly. She said she'd spent years trying to pull those fragments into something coherent, but they never held together. They were like trying to catch smoke. Then, about 4 months ago, she had been cleaning out her storage unit, a small space she rented to hold the accumulated possessions of 38 years, and she had found a box she didn't remember packing. Inside, it was a water-damaged notebook. Parts of it were illegible, but on the inside, front cover, written in faded blue ink, were the words, Ray Calloway, 406-555-0173, Billings, MT. If anything happens to me, call Ray. She didn't know who had written it. She didn't know if the handwriting was hers, but she had looked at that name for a long time, and something in her chest had shifted in a way she couldn't explain. She did an internet search and found an obituary. Carol Ann Calloway, Billings, Montana, drowned in the Yellowstone River, April 1987. Survived by her parents, Gerald and Loretta Calloway, and her brother, Raymond Calloway. Margaret told me that she sat with that obituary for 2 weeks before she wrote the letter. I asked her what changed. She said she had gone to the doctor for a routine checkup, and her doctor had done a standard health history, and Margaret had written unknown in every family history field the way she always did. And the doctor had looked at her across the desk and said, gently, "You've never tried to find out?" And Margaret had said no. And the doctor had said it might be worth trying. So she wrote the letter. I told her I needed some time. She said she understood. She gave me her address and said if I wanted to come to Wyoming, she would answer any question I had. I didn't sleep well for 3 nights. I called my daughter, Linda, and I told her the whole story. There was a long silence on her end, And then she said, "Dad, that's either the most heartbreaking thing I've ever heard, or it's a scam. You need to find out which one it is." She offered to fly out. I told her not yet. I told her I wanted to go to Wyoming myself first. Before I went, I did two things. The first was that I drove to Rimrock Cemetery and stood at my sister's grave for about 20 minutes. The headstone reads, Carol Ann Calloway, 1963, 1987, beloved daughter and sister, gone too soon. I have stood at that grave so many times over the years that the ground in front of it has a slight depression from where I've stood. I looked at it that day and thought about my father's face in that cold room in 1987, and I felt something loosening inside me that I didn't know how to name. The second thing I did was call the Yellowstone County Sheriff's Office. I spoke to a deputy who was patient and kind, and who told me, carefully, that there was no way to reopen a case from 1987 based on a letter alone, but that if I could obtain a DNA comparison, that would be the appropriate next step. I drove to Casper on a Thursday morning, 6 hours each way, across some of the emptiest and most beautiful country in the American West. I had time to think. Margaret lived in a small beige house on a quiet street. She had a flower bed in front that was still dormant from winter, and a welcome mat that said, "Home," in simple letters. She opened the door before I knocked. She must have heard my truck, and we stood on either side of her threshold and looked at each other for a long moment. She was 58 years old. She had brown hair, gray at the temples, cut practically short. She was about 5'4", slender, with something careful in the way she held herself, like a person who had learned very early that the world required patience. She was wearing a green sweater. She had our mother's eyes. I don't mean that loosely. I mean that when she looked at me, I felt the exact specific shock of recognition that you only feel when you see something your nervous system already knows. Our mother had a particular shade of gray-green, and the particular quality of steadiness in her gaze. And Margaret had both of those things in a way that made my throat close. I managed to say, "Hello, Margaret." She said, "Hello, Ray." And then her face did something complicated, and she looked down and she said, "I'm sorry. I've been trying to figure out what to say for 4 months, and I still don't know." I told her that was all right. I told her I didn't know either. She had made coffee. We sat at her kitchen table, small, clean, with a vase of dried flowers in the center, and she told me everything she hadn't put in the letter. She told me about the first years, the disorientation of not knowing who you were, the grief of losing a self you couldn't even remember having. She told me about the dreams she used to have of a yellow kitchen, of someone calling her name from another room. I asked her if she remembered the name they were calling. She looked at me steadily and said, "For the first time in my life, I think I might." When I read the obituary and I saw the name Carol, something happened. I don't know if that's memory or if that's wanting. But something happened. I told her about my father's face in the identification room. I told her about the blue fleece jacket. She went very quiet when I said that. Then she said, slowly, "I've always hated blue fleece. I don't know why. I can't wear it. Something about it makes me feel wrong. I don't know if that proves anything. I know that I held on to it. Before I had driven down to Wyoming, I had contacted a private DNA testing service that specialized in family reunification cases. I had my own sample ready, and I had asked Margaret by phone if she would be willing to submit one. She had said yes, immediately, without hesitation. That morning, we completed the collection together. She was calm about it in the way that people are calm when they have been holding their breath for a very long time and are finally exhaling. She showed me the notebook. The water damage had destroyed most of the pages, but the inside cover was still legible. Ray Calloway, 406-555-0173, Billings, MT. If anything happens to me, call Ray. The handwriting was faded and warped by moisture, but it had a quality I recognized. Carol had written in long, slightly slanted letters, with a particular way of forming the letter R. That notebook had the same thing. I photographed it with my phone. She showed me the other thing, too, the reason she had finally sent the letter when she did. At the bottom of that same box, beneath the notebook, was a photograph. Old, printed on the thick paper they used in the early 80s, the colors slightly faded. It showed two children, a boy and a girl, standing in front of a hay bale, squinting into the sun. The boy was wearing a red flannel shirt. The girl had dark hair and green eyes and was laughing at something off camera. I knew that photograph. It had lived on my parents' refrigerator for 20 years. My mother took it on a September afternoon when I was about 9 and Carol was 5. I had assumed it was lost when we cleared out the house after my father died. I had not thought about it in years. I looked at it in Margaret's kitchen and my hands were shaking. She asked me if I recognized it. I told her I was the boy in the red shirt. Neither of us said anything for a while. On the drive home, I called my daughter. I told her about the eyes, the jacket, the notebook, the photograph. Linda was quiet in the way she gets when she's trying not to fall apart. Then she said, "Dad, don't let yourself hope too much until the DNA comes back." I told her I was trying. She said she was getting on a plane this weekend. I didn't argue. The results came back in 11 days. 11 of the longest days I have experienced since the 8 days between Darlene's diagnosis and her surgery, when everything felt like waiting and there was nothing to do but endure. I worked my land. I split wood. I made phone calls about nothing. I watched bad television. I reread the letter 17 times. On the 11th day, the email arrived. I read it at my kitchen table with Linda sitting across from me. She had come from Colorado and had been staying in the spare room for 3 days. She was holding my hand when I opened the laptop. The report was thorough and technical, full of language about alleles and statistical probability, but the conclusion was not technical at all. It was simple. It said that the genetic comparison indicated a full sibling relationship with a probability exceeding 99.98%. Margaret Holt was Carol Ann Calloway. Linda made a sound I will never forget. Not crying exactly, more like the sound of something releasing that has been under too much pressure for too long. She stood up and came around the table and put her arms around me, and I sat there in my kitchen and cried harder than I had cried since I was 27 years old, standing in the rain at a cemetery, watching them lower a casket into the ground. We called Margaret together. She answered in that same quiet, prepared voice. I told her the results. There was silence on her end for a very long time, long enough that I asked if she was still there. She said, "Yes, I'm here." And then she said, "I always felt like I was missing something. My whole life. I thought it was just the memory. But it wasn't only the memory, was it? It was all of you." Carol came to Montana 2 weeks later. I am going to call her Carol because that is her name, even though she still sometimes flinches slightly when she hears it, the way you flinch at a sound that's very close to a sound, you know, but not quite right. She says it's becoming more natural. She says she's working on it. I drove to the airport to pick her up. I was standing at the arrivals gate, and I saw her come through the doors. And she was wearing a green jacket this time, and she had a single carry-on bag. And she stopped when she saw me, and we stood there about 20 feet apart for a moment that felt suspended outside of ordinary time. Then she walked toward me, and I walked toward her. And when we met in the middle, she put her arms around me, and I put mine around her. And she was trembling slightly, and I was too. And she smelled, and I realize how strange this sounds, but I need to say it, she smelled like the house we grew up in. Some mixture of cold air and something woody and clean that I couldn't name, but that my body knew immediately. She said, against my shoulder, "I'm sorry it took me so long." I said, "You have nothing to be sorry for." We drove back to the ranch. She looked out the window at the land the whole way and didn't say much. At one point, she said, "I've dreamed about this. Mountains and plains together like this. I always thought it was just something my mind invented." Linda was waiting at the house. She had made dinner. She had put flowers on the table. She is 28 years old, and she never knew her Aunt Carol. And yet when Carol walked through the door, Linda took one look at her and burst into tears, because those eyes don't lie. Those eyes come from the same place. We sat at the table, the three of us, and we talked for 4 hours. I have had a great many meals in my life, but I will remember that one until the day I die. Carol told us what she could piece together, combining fragments of her recovered memory with what she'd been able to learn over the years. What she understood was that, after the raft capsized, she had been swept a considerable distance downstream and then pulled from the water by someone she couldn't name or identify. She believed she had been unconscious. She had fractured ribs and a head injury that her doctors later told her was significant enough to cause both anterograde and retrograde amnesia. She couldn't form new memories, clearly, for some period after the injury, and she lost access to most of what had come before. How she ended up in Sheridan, Wyoming, 200 miles from where the accident happened, she didn't know. The gap between the river and the hospital bed was simply gone. 38 years of trying to recover it had yielded almost nothing. I have wondered about that gap ever since. I have my own theory that I keep to myself, or I keep mostly to myself. A person doesn't move 200 miles in that condition by themselves. Someone helped. Whether that help was kind or otherwise, whether there was a reason Carol ended up stripped of any identification in a hospital with no way to trace her back to her family, I don't know. The person or persons involved are beyond reach now, in all probability. I have learned to put things I cannot change in a particular place in my mind, where they can exist without consuming me. But there is one thing I have not put away, and will not put away, and that is this. Someone is buried in Rimrock Cemetery, under my sister's name, who is not my sister. We don't know who she was. She was a young woman, approximately Carol's age, with dark hair, found in the Yellowstone River 3 days after the accident. She was wearing Carol's jacket. My father, in his grief and his certainty, identified her as his daughter. None of us questioned it. In 1987, there was no DNA testing readily available for cases like this. There was a grieving family and a body and a burial, and that was how the story ended. But it didn't end there. It ended somewhere else, for someone else. There is a family somewhere, or there was, those decades ago, who lost a young woman that spring and never knew what happened to her. They filed a missing persons report, or they didn't. They waited, or they stopped waiting. They put a name on a list, or they decided she had simply left and not come back, and they carried that with them for the rest of their lives. I have thought about that family every day since I opened Carol's letter. I contacted the Yellowstone County Sheriff's Department within the week of getting the DNA results. I also hired an attorney, a woman in Billings named Patricia Voss, who specializes in cases involving wrongful death and identity law, and who has dealt with situations like this before. She told me that the proper course was to petition for an exhumation order, which would allow the remains in the grave at Rimrock Cemetery to be subjected to modern DNA testing. Those results could then be compared against national missing persons databases, including NamUs, the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, to try to establish who she actually was. It is not a fast process. It is not a simple process. There is a significant amount of documentation required, and there are legal thresholds that have to be met, and there are notifications that have to be served, and all of it takes time. Patricia told me it could be a year, possibly more. I told her I had waited 38 years already. I told her to proceed. I want whoever she was to have her name back. I want her family, if anyone is left who remembers her, to know what happened. She was someone's daughter. She was possibly someone's sister. She deserved better than to be buried under another woman's name in a corner of Montana she may never have seen while she was living. I don't know what else to do for her except this, and I intend to see it through. Carol comes to Montana often now. She flew out 4 times in the first year, which surprised both of us. She is not a person who moves quickly, and I respected that. But she keeps coming back. She told me once that it feels like recalibrating, like her internal compass had been pointing at nothing for 38 years and has now found magnetic north, and she keeps wanting to stand near it. She has started to remember things. Not big things, not dramatic revelations, small things. The way our mother made biscuits, pressing the cutter down without twisting. A particular song that was played on the radio in our kitchen on Sunday mornings. The dog we had when she was little, a brown mutt named Pepper who would sleep on her feet in winter. She told me about Pepper on a Tuesday evening in November, sitting in my living room with a cup of coffee, and the way her face looked when she said it, the way it lit with genuine surprise at her own memory, made me put my hand over my eyes for a moment. She doesn't remember the accident. Her doctors have told her she likely never will. That section of her life is simply gone, closed off by the injury like a road washed out in a flood. She has made her peace with that, she says, or mostly has. She is 58 years old, and she is pragmatic in the way that people become when they have had to build themselves from scratch. I drove her to the cemetery in February. We went on a clear, cold day when the ground was frozen and the sky was that particular Montana blue that looks unreal, almost painted. I pulled up to the gate and asked her if she was sure. She said yes. We walked to the stone together. She read it for a long time. Carol Ann Calloway, 1963, 1987. Beloved daughter and sister, gone too soon. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she said quietly, "I'm sorry about whoever she was." I said, "Me too." She reached out and touched the top of the stone, just briefly, with her fingertips. A gesture that struck me as both tender and sorrowful toward a stranger who had lived out her death for her. Then she stepped back and stood next to me, and we stayed there together until the cold got to be too much. And then we walked back to the truck. On the drive home, she said, "Do you think they'll be able to find out who she was?" I said I hoped so. I said we were going to try. She nodded and looked out the window. Then she said, "What was I like before?" It was the first time she had asked me that directly. I had been waiting for it, in a way. I had been thinking about how to answer it honestly and not sentimentally. I thought about it for a moment, watching the road, and then I said, "You were the best of us. You always were. You remembered things that mattered. You showed up when you didn't have to. You had the loudest laugh in any room you were in, and the quietest patience. You were exactly the kind of person that makes a family hold together." She was quiet for a bit. Then she said, "I'm not sure I'm still all of those things." I said, "You sent a letter to a stranger, asking if you might be his sister. You weren't sure he'd answer. You sent it anyway. I think you're still most of those things." She didn't say anything to that, but she was almost smiling, looking out at the plains. I want to say something now to anyone listening who has a name on a list somewhere. A brother, a sister, a child. Someone who disappeared into the gap between a before and an after, and who never came back, and who you've spent years either looking for or trying to stop looking for. I know that hope is a dangerous thing. I know that it has cost some of you more than you can afford. I know that the difference between hope and denial is sometimes impossible to see from the inside. But Carol was in a small house in Wyoming for 38 years, tending a garden and feeding a cat, and going to work and building a quiet life on a foundation of not knowing. And she was alive. The whole time, she was alive. She just couldn't find her way back to us. And we didn't know to look for her there. If there is someone in your life who is gone in a way that never felt finished, please consider DNA databases. Please consider missing persons registries. Please consider the possibility that the ending you got was not the whole story. Technology has changed in ways that make the impossible considerably less so. I am not promising you what happened to me. I am not promising you a Tuesday afternoon letter and a green-eyed woman on the other side of it. I'm telling you that it happened to me, against every expectation I had, after 38 years of a grief I had sealed and set aside because I didn't know what else to do with it. Patricia called me last week with an update on the legal process. "We are making progress," she said. "It is slow, but it is moving forward." She believes we have a reasonable chance of getting the exhumation order within the next 8 to 10 months. I told her to keep pushing. I told her there was a family somewhere who deserved the same thing. Mine just got not a miracle, not a resurrection, but simply the truth. Simply knowing. That's what I keep coming back to. The truth. 38 years ago, a series of accidents and injuries and misidentifications set in motion a story that should have been impossible, and somehow all of us, my family, some unknown woman's family, and Carol herself, lived inside that impossible story for nearly 4 decades. And now there is a chance to correct it. Not all of it. The years don't come back. The parents who died without knowing the truth don't come back. The first meeting at the hospital in 1987, the years Carol could have had with the people who loved her, none of that comes back. But we have now. Carol and I have now. Lindy has an aunt she didn't know existed. And somewhere, if everything goes the way I hope, a family is going to find out what happened to the young woman they lost in the spring of 1987, and they will be able to grieve her properly, and they will be able to give her the right name. That matters. That is not nothing. Carol called me this morning. She does that now, calls in the morning sometimes. Nothing in particular to say. She told me it frosted in Casper last night. Hard frost. Probably killed the last of the fall flowers she'd left in. She sounded unbothered by it. She said she was thinking of planting something different in the spring. She asked me what flowers our mother used to grow. I told her. Zinnias and snapdragons. Every summer. In the bed along the south side of the house. I told her our mother grew them from seed, starting them indoors in March. Rows of small paper cups lined up along the kitchen windowsill. There was a pause. Then Carol said, very quietly, "The yellow curtains." I asked what she meant. She said, "I've dreamed about a kitchen with yellow curtains my whole life. I could never figure out what it was. It was the windowsill, the seed cups in front of the yellow curtains." We were both quiet for a moment. Then I said, "Yes, that's exactly what it was." And she said, "Okay, just that, okay." Like a door closing gently on 38 years of not knowing. Like a window opening on everything still left. I think she's going to be all right. I think we both are.